Just to organize this stuff first. Before I begin my speech, I would first like to thank my debate team for all the work we did together as a team that made my success at the district possible at all. Specifically, I greatly appreciate Captain Ferris's guidance through the tumultuous seas of debate over this last arduous year. I would also like to thank my parents for supporting me through both the heartbreaks and successes I've experienced this year. I can't thank my coach, Bob Schertz, enough for the time and commitment he's granted me in these 3 years of debate, my brother, who isn't here right now, for inspiring me countless times to exceed in Lincoln Douglas debate and extending his intellect to my education, and finally, Baker Hostetler and the City Club for making all of this possible today. It's great that we can receive recognition for our hard work and prestige to strive throughout our debating careers. I and many others truly appreciate that effort. So let's begin. Since international courts are counterproductive to the protection of rights, I negate. The Oxford English Dictionary defines the word ought as bound or under moral obligation. So, to assess these obligations, I value morality defined as the goodness or badness of an action. Since all people have intrinsic worth, violating their most basic rights on a wide scale is immoral, so my value criterion is protecting human rights. Crimes against humanity are the culmination of systemic flaws and social divides, and in turn embody the dissolution of the established order within victimized societies. In the international sphere, maintaining that order is paramount to protect people's rights on a wide scale. As Stephen D. Krasner explains, in a domestic court setting, you don't want the judge or jury saying, if I convict this guy, his gang will be mad, and so they're going to shoot 10 other people. But in the international level, that kind of thinking is utterly irresponsible because the critical issue at the international level is how you can maintain order, ideally have peace, and save lives. That utilitarian imperative leads to this key observation. In order to prove we actually have a moral obligation to submit to the international court, the affirmative must show that it would actually be an effective way to stabilize the nations it targets for two reasons. First, if the court does not fulfill its intended purpose, we don't have an obligation to uphold it. Rather, it should be condemned for its failures. And second, because the U.S. is so powerful, its endorsement of a flawed system would only help perpetuate it, making atrocities more difficult to prevent in the long term. My sole contention is that international courts fail to fix the underlying causes of atrocities. First, international courts inherently fail to associate with native cultural norms preventing social reform, Jean Kirkpatrick explains. Multilateral decision-making increases the cultural, political, and geographical distance between those who choose decision-makers, those who make decisions, and those affected by these decisions. Abstract relations cannot produce the same solidarity among people as common identifications, education, and experience. So, since crimes against humanity are rooted in deep societal flaws, international courts will always fail to fix those underlying social problems, nor achieve widespread acceptance as a legitimate authority, making social reform impossible. Second, the concept of prosecuting individuals for crimes against humanity is intrinsically arbitrary. As Mark Osiel explains, prosecutors choose to aim for the highest-ranking offenders. This approach fails to win public acceptance because it risks drawing a line between the morally blameworthy and blameless parties that strikes many people as morally arbitrary. Because many people make substantial contributions to administrative massacre, it follows that to single out a small subset appears to many as unjust. Thus, prosecuting individuals serves to worsen societal problems even more by drawing morally arbitrary lines between the blameworthy and the blameless, polarizing people against the international court's proceedings, and entrenching society in conflict, so we do not have a moral obligation to uphold it. These conclusions are empirically supported. The New York Times reported in 2008 that after 16 years under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, Prime Minister Dodik said the dissolution of the old state and the war that followed had destroyed whatever optimism he once had about ethnic groups collectively deciding one another's fates. Bosnia is a divided country, he said. There's not a single event or holiday that we can celebrate together. I have lost all my illusions. The ICTY has clearly done nothing to resolve the ethnic tensions that caused the genocide to happen in the first place. Thus, international courts reinforce the norms that breed atrocities and fail to fix the root causes of genocide, so the U.S. does not have a moral obligation to submit to an international court. Let's move to the affirmative side now. My opponent does not provide a definition for ought. He says that it just deals with obligations in general. However, I would contend that my definition about moral obligations as a more specific thing is better for several reasons. First, I actually give a resource where it came from, the Oxford English Dictionary, and that's credible. But second of all, as he explained himself, the problem with a hitman signing a contract to kill somebody, although he made an obligation for himself to kill that man, there's a moral problem with that. It's inherently immoral to kill somebody. So he said this himself in his own cross-examination, and so ought does imply some moral imperative. So at that point, when we look towards governmental obligations, we have to focus specifically on what the government is morally obligated to do. And furthermore, when we look towards his value criterion of national security, we have to focus on, we also have to take into account the fact that rights, no matter where you're from, you have intrinsic worth, and people are essentially equal throughout the entire world. So we have to consider people's rights regardless of where you're from. Thus, just protecting our own national security isn't sufficient for us to ever achieve morality in any sense. Then we move to the first contention, where he says that the first part is where he says that unilateralism is bad and it fosters anti-Americanism. But the negative doesn't have to propose unilateralism. He tries asserting in cross-examination that the negative world, that if we don't submit to an international court, we have to act unilaterally. But here's an alternative where we wouldn't be acting unilaterally. For example, as Mark OCL explains, a third alternative to criminal prosecution employed recently in Uruguay, Chile, Uganda, and South Africa, and many other places is an official investigation and report laying bare the facts in all their sordid detail. By knowing what happened, a nation is able to debate honestly why and how dreadful crimes came to be committed. To identify those responsible and to show what they did is to mark them with a public stigma that's a punishment in itself, and to identify the victims and recall how they were tortured and killed is a way of acknowledging their worth and dignity. So through things like an investigative report, which can happen through multilateral cooperation, but focuses specifically on the cultural problems that exist in those nations and allows people within those nations to make decisions for themselves, is not a unilateral solution, has happened in 4 other countries already, and has proven itself to be an effective way of dealing with crimes against humanity and preventing them in the future. Then we move to the second argument, where he says that it undermines moral leadership. But just because we don't submit to an international court, that doesn't mean that we aren't subscribing to international moral norms. For example, we can follow the UN human rights declarations in the actions that we make throughout society, and that's a way of applying to those norms. But even further, I already gave you an alternative where that isn't the case. Then we go to the double standard argument. But what if we as I've shown to you, we don't have to oppose the international court because we don't want to be part of it, but rather because we oppose the values on which it rests. And so if that's made clear, then we don't get that double standard. And finally, against terrorist networks, I gave you I showed you already that the problem is that he's assuming that terrorism would actually be deterred by prosecution, but those aren't the root causes of terrorism in the first place.
Does the U.S. government have obligations to Americans?
Yes, but it also has obligations to others throughout the world.
Which obligation is greater?
When we're talking about legal obligations, yes, Americans are greater. But when we're talking about moral obligations, we have to look at the world objectively, and we have to look towards people's human rights throughout the world.
Are you arguing that the U.S. has just as much of an obligation to North Koreans as it does to American citizens?
When we're talking about protecting people's human rights, yes. When we're talking about just defending the world, then no.
Okay. Your first point about why the court will be ineffective is that we have to look at native social norms instead, correct?
Yes.
Are you saying that a country has to deal with its own atrocities internally?
No. Well, I would argue that to a certain extent, at least, people within those nations have to have a say in their own investigations. Sure.